Under the stadium lights, he was unstoppable. Quick feet, big goals, the kind of player who made defenders panic. Quincy Promes was living the dream. Champions League nights, 50 caps for his country, millions in the bank. But far from the pitch, another game was unfolding. 2 shipping containers, 1,000 kilos of cocaine, a knife pulled at a family party, and through it all, he kept playing, posting and smiling. This is the story of a Dutch footballer who had everything and how he still chose the criminal world. He was born in Amsterdam, but his blood ran from Suriname. Quincy Promes grew up in the Bijlmer, a rough part of the city with tower blocks, tight spaces and big dreams. Football was everywhere. On pavements, car parks, pitches scratched into grass. Promes couldn't stop. From dawn to nightfall, he chased the ball, weaving through corners, learning tricks, AMD testing every move. His father had played back in Suriname. His mother, W's the one who scolded him for ignoring school. But even she couldn't deny it. Her boy had talent. By 16, he was turning heads at a local amateur club. A scout spotted him, and within weeks, he was in the youth ranks at Ajax, the Netherlands' most iconic football academy. But talent wasn't the issue. Attitude was. He argued with coaches, skipped rules, and thought talent was enough. Ajax dropped him. For Promes, it was a crushing blow. He later called it the worst day of his life. He nearly quit. But his mother pushed him on, told him to keep going, and he did. He rebuilt himself at 20. Smaller club, lower pressure, but more freedom to grow. Then a call came from Spartak Moscow in 2014. Russia's biggest club offered him a 5-year deal. He took it. New country, new challenges. But the same outcome: goals, assists, and trophies. The fans adored him. He was their star. By 2017, he was the Russian Premier League's top scorer. Then came Spain. Sevilla picked him up in 2018. It didn't last long, but it didn't need to, because within a season, Ajax came calling again. The club that once let him go now paid nearly 16 million euros to bring him back. And back home, he was called up for the national team. 50 caps followed, 7 goals. He played alongside the likes of Van Dijk, Wijnaldum, and Memphis Depay. Promes had become a regular in the Oranje squad, even making it to Euro 2020. Off the pitch, he flaunted the fortune. But with status came silence. Few questioned who was around him, or what those new connections meant, because in public, he was the star winger. But in private, something darker had already begun to grow. He looked untouchable. Luxury holidays in Dubai, diamond watches and supercars. Quincy Promes didn't just play like a star, he lived like one. Every post, every story, polished and sharp. But underneath the surface, things weren't as smooth. Those closest to him said he'd changed, surrounded by new faces. Friends who weren't really friends. People who didn't care about football, only the money it brought. He flashed wealth online, but it wasn't just prize money or sponsorship deals. Prosecutors said the numbers didn't add up. Something else was funding the lifestyle. There were whispers, then police intel that Promes had links to organized crime figures in the Netherlands. One name stood out: Piet Wortel, a major player in Dutch drug trafficking. Later, according to Dutch prosecutors, Promes paid Wortel 250,000 euros, settling a debt after a drug shipment was stolen in a rip deal. We will talk about it later. Criminologists said it wasn't new. That money, fame, and young athletes often attract the wrong attention. But Promes's case stood out, not just for who he was, but for how bold it had become. Later, prosecutors laid it out in court. This wasn't a case of a player caught on the edge of something big. Promes, they claimed, was at the center, but we will talk about it later. At that point, police didn't have solid proof, just fragments. Tips, movements, and names they were starting to watch closely. Then, in January 2020, 2 containers landed in Antwerp. And everything they'd been tracking came into view. It started with a name, whispered through an intel tip. The port of Antwerp is Europe's back door, a key landing point for cargo that hides more than what's on the manifest. In January 2020, 2 shipments arrived there from Brazil. On paper, it was sea salt, but inside there was 1,360 kilos of high-purity cocaine split across 2 containers. One load was 650 kilograms. The other, just days later, carried 713 kilograms. The first container was quietly extracted from the port and moved to a nearby warehouse. The second wasn't so lucky. The container looked normal until officers ran it through imaging. Hidden within, buried deep inside the cargo, was 713 kilos of high-grade cocaine. Later, authorities tracked the first container to a warehouse. When they raided it, checks revealed it contained 650 kilos of cocaine. At this point, they only had 1 container in their positions. Now, investigators were racing to catch up. They retraced both shipments, entry scans, container IDs, port logs. Belgian and Dutch authorities began working together, piecing together how the drugs had passed inspection and where the trail led next. The containers hadn't just arrived by chance. They were moved with precision, offloaded, redirected, and secured before collection. Whoever was behind it knew the port well, knew the timing and the gaps. Officers quietly secured the seized container. What they had now was real. 2 confirmed shipments, 1 caught, 1 is gone, and a new operation is beginning to surface. The names behind it were still buried, but the physical part of the case was now in place. The digital part was about to begin. Now, investigators had more than cocaine. They had a starting point. Customs officers passed the container details to the Dutch criminal intelligence team. From there, the real search began, not for the product, but for the people. Phones were already in their possession, devices seized from suspects linked to the warehouse and port logistics. Inside those phones were encrypted apps, mostly BlackBerry devices running secure communication platforms used by organized crime. Investigators began working through the data. Deleted messages were recovered, chat histories reconstructed, and slowly the operation's structure came into focus. One name that stood out in the background was Quincy Promes. He never appeared in surveillance at the docks, never touched the containers. But messages pulled from other suspects referenced someone in control, someone funding it. One conversation detailed a €200,000 investment. Another noted that half the load was lost, matching the timeline of the seized second container. Police pulled location data, matched dates, bank transfers. They traced contacts between known traffickers and a number registered in Promes' name. The chats didn't use his full name, but the timing, language, and financial figures were enough to raise the alarm. Then came another link. A known trafficker, Pierre Wartel, had Promes' number saved in his phone. Wartel denied any connection, but forensic analysis confirmed contact had occurred during the exact window of the shipment. Before moving deeper into the trafficking case, one violent moment from Promes' personal life demands attention, a moment that would land him in court long before the cocaine ever did. It was meant to be a family gathering. Summer 2020, the town of Abcuda, just south of Amsterdam, a quiet rented warehouse where relatives came together for food and celebration. But behind the smiles, tension simmered. At some point in the evening, Promes and a cousin got into an argument. The issue was about a stolen necklace. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It had family weight, personal meaning, and by some accounts, pride tied into it. Words turned into shouting. Then came the knife. Promes stabbed his cousin twice, once in the knee, once in the leg. The blade caught a tendon. The young man was rushed to hospital, bleeding heavily. He survived, but doctors said he lost full mobility in the leg. Running, squatting, even walking with ease would be long-term challenges. He wasn't a stranger to football either. The injury ended any future in sport, and it left psychological scars too. A cousin he once admired had turned violent in seconds. Police didn't learn about the attack right away. They only found out because they were already tapping Promes' phone in connection with a separate investigation. The stabbing surfaced in a recorded conversation and triggered a deeper look. When the case reached court in 2023, Promes didn't attend. He stayed in Moscow. His legal team argued that the attack wasn't premeditated. Prosecutors countered that he showed pride in the violence, even warning others they'd face bullets if they crossed him again. The court dropped attempted murder and manslaughter charges due to lack of planning, but it found him guilty of aggravated assault. Promes was sentenced in absentia to 18 months in prison for this case. While that assault charge played out in one courtroom, another case, far larger and far more damaging, was building in the background. What followed was 2 separate trials, no appearances, and 2 prison sentences handed down without him ever stepping inside the dock. By the time both cases reached court, Quincy Promes had already made one thing clear: he wouldn't be showing up. He remained in Moscow, still under contract with Spartak, still training, still playing. And while prosecutors laid out their evidence in Dutch courtrooms, Promes didn't take the stand. He didn't even enter the country. The first trial concluded in June 2023. The charge: aggravated assault. The court found Promes guilty of stabbing his cousin in the leg at a family party in Abkuda. Prosecutors argued he showed no remorse and even took pride in what he'd done. The court agreed, sentencing him to 18 months in prison. He wasn't there to hear it. Just months later, a second case moved to trial. This time, it was about the cocaine, 1,360 kilos shipped from Brazil and intercepted in Antwerp. The court heard how Promes had invested heavily in the operation, that his messages had been recovered from encrypted phones, that he'd calculated his losses when the second container was seized. Prosecutors asked for 9 years. The judge handed him 6. Both sentences were delivered in absentia, a rarity but not unprecedented. Dutch courts allow it in cases where a suspect is deliberately avoiding justice, and the evidence is overwhelming. Promes denied all charges through his legal team. They announced plans to appeal both verdicts, stating that as long as the verdict is not final, every suspect must be presumed innocent. But outside the courtroom, frustration was building. The public saw a footballer convicted twice, still flying, still earning, still untouched. He wasn't behind bars, he hadn't answered questions, he hadn't even sat in court, and that silence was growing louder. Just months after his assault conviction, Promes was on trial again, this time for drug trafficking on an international scale. In the Amsterdam District Court, prosecutors laid out a detailed case. They said the footballer wasn't just linked to the drugs, he was embedded in the structure that moved them. This wasn't about a single message or transaction. This was about role, timing, and control. They began with logistics. 2 shipments, 650 kilograms and 713 kilograms, that we have already covered. Prosecutors claimed were part of a network in which Promes held a managerial role. The prosecution presented timelines, the container's arrival, the communications that followed, payment activity before and after. They mapped his movements against dates tied to the shipments. They brought forward financial analysts who flagged unexplained transfers and rapid withdrawals from accounts associated with Promes' known entities. The defense pushed back. They said the messages didn't prove control, that Promes wasn't on the containers, that he wasn't the one collecting packages or issuing orders. They challenged the phone evidence, suggested it was circumstantial, but the judge didn't buy it. In the written verdict, the court said Promes was directly involved in both shipments. He didn't need to carry bricks, nor to make calls. He was higher up the chain, the organizer or investor, the one who let others do the dirty work. Prosecutors asked for 9 years, but the court gave him 6 years of imprisonment in absentia. No courtroom appearance, no defense testimony, just the evidence, and a player still on the run. But the story didn't end there. A conviction without a courtroom appearance was one thing. Bringing him back to serve it would be something else entirely. And what is coming next is a long, waiting, and hard part to bring him back. Before moving forward, the response across Dutch football was immediate. Ajax, once the club that re-signed him for €16 million, released a statement condemning his actions. Other teams quietly reviewed their mentorship policies. Several brought in ex-police officers to speak with academy players. Not about football, but about the streets, the money, the people waiting at the edges of the game. Promes had become more than a court case. He was now a cautionary tale. And now it's... As we discussed earlier, he had left the Netherlands before both trials and returned to Russia, rejoining Spartak Moscow and continuing his career without interruption. Dutch authorities issued warrants. Interpol issued a red notice. But Russia had no extradition treaty with the Netherlands. For years, Promes remained beyond reach, playing in domestic leagues, scoring goals, and posting from penthouses and private jets. Then came a slip. In March 2024, during a training camp with Spartak Moscow in Dubai, Promes tried to fly out of the UAE. Border authorities flagged his name. He was arrested at Dubai International Airport, not initially for drug charges, but over a local traffic offence. Still, the Dutch notice was on file, and prosecutors acted fast. Negotiations began. The UAE and Netherlands had signed an extradition treaty in 2021, but enforcement remained case by case. For months, Promes remained in the UAE under restrictions, not jailed, but unable to leave. In June 2024, Spartak terminated his contract. He quietly signed with Dubai United, a second-tier club that kept him in play while legal talks continued. But his position was weakening. His passport was restricted. His appeal was pending. The Dutch were watching. Then, in June 2025, it ended. Promes was detained again. This time, there was no delay. Just a few days before, on the 20th of June 2025, he was extradited to the Netherlands aboard a chartered flight, escorted, processed, and transferred directly into Dutch custody, this time in handcuffs. Within hours, the court confirmed what had already been decided in his absence. 6 years for cocaine trafficking, plus 18 months for aggravated assault. The sentences would be served consecutively. There would be no early release, no suspended term. His lawyers filed an appeal, but until it's resolved, Promes remains behind bars. The earliest he could walk free is 2030. What do you make of the case and the sentence? Was justice served, or was the damage already done? Let us know your thoughts below. And if you want more true UK crime stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's always another case to uncover.